Welcome back, folks, to our podcast, Therapy on a Tangent. I'm Zori with my co-host, Natalie. Say hi, Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie.
And this is a podcast where two therapists nerd out about our geeky passions and mental health. Natalie, it's been a while since we talked. So what have you been nerding about recently?
So I feel the need to follow up on this because it is a new year, and I said I was going to finish one of my Legend of Zelda games. And I'm happy to report I actually finished Breath of the Wild.
Woo, woo, woo!
I did cut it really close. It was definitely like middle toward the end of the summer by the time I finished it. But it was really good. And, I think something that I'm a little frustrated about is that you can't, like, it's not like you end the game and then that's it. It's like, we'll take you back to the checkpoint before you beat the boss. Sorry if that's a spoiler for people who haven't finished Breath of the Wild, but it's been years, so people should know by now. But it's not like, oh, you got the achievement, you beat the boss kind of thing. It's like, okay, here's the acknowledgement. Now just continue on with your daily life in the game. So I wish there was something to signify, like, I finished the game. But I guess there is. I don't know. It just feels weird because it's so open-ended, but I guess that's the point of an open-ended world in some ways. But it was definitely a lot of fun. I think definitely forced me to, like, lock in and be focused on the mission. Because there's definitely times where I just want to, like, wander into the woods again. And I'm just like, no, I gotta stay on task. I gotta finish my goal. So, yeah, happy to report I did it. So, what about you, Zori?
Yay. So happy. So I've always been interested in anime, so I kind of really gotten back into watching anime. I always had this excuse like I don't have time to watch anime, but I love anime. So I've on Netflix there's this new anime called Sakamoto Days, and I really like it. It kind of gives similar vibes to what is it, Legend of the House Husband.
Oh, that's such a great show.
I just really like that, where like this guy, he's a family man, but he also used to be an assassin. And now he's trying to get out of the game, but people want him either back in the game or want him dead. So now he has to like fight back, but not kill anyone because killing people is the number one family rule. You can't kill anyone or else his wife will divorce him. But he has to protect his family. He has to protect his blood family, his newfound family, which are also other members of like assassin groups and whatever. So yeah, it's just really fun and cute, and it like makes things I love like action, but also with like found family trope, which yeah. So I've been watching it. There's only a few episodes currently as of recording, but so far so good. Recommend it for anyone who likes those type of things. I told a friend it kind of gave me Street Fighter vibes in terms of like the action, but then again wholesome found family vibes as well.
Yeah, we should do just like a separate segment of Zori's anime recommendations.
Oh my gosh. Some of them would probably be a little bit old because again, I have not been watching. I think the only other anime that I've been watching recently is Dandadan, and apparently it's currently on break until I think the summer for season 2. But yeah, I mean, yeah, we can have a little things that Zori has been watching anime wise. So, Natalie, it is our first episode back in the new year, 2025. And a lot of things have been happening in this new year. And as of recording, it is in the first week of February, so still very early on in the year. A lot of stuff has been popping up on news feeds, on social media, and stuff like that. And what I wanted to talk to you is about media overload. So, like, talking about is it ever possible to be overloaded by the media, to be overinformed? Is there a healthy balance of consumption? So, Natalie, what are your thoughts?
Well, I want to say that this is definitely a topic that has come up a lot in therapy with my clients, but also with like friends in real life as well, just because there's a lot going on that's happening in media through like news outlets, social media, all those things wherever you get information. And I do think it's possible to be overwhelmed and overloaded by media because just because of the sheer volume of things, but also like the
Mhm.
intensity of things that are going on.
Yes, definitely. And similarly, been talking to a lot of students about what's been going on. And let's just name it. Natalie and I are both in the US, so there's a lot in regards to this current administration that's happening that's impacting us as counselors and us as individuals. And especially as counselors, we have to think about like how do we do our jobs ethically, obviously do our jobs legally, but also the crux of the of our roles as counselor is non maleficence, aka
Mm-hmm.
do no harm. So how do we make sure that we're doing the least amount of harm to our client? So, yeah, we've been having a lot of conversations with my students as well about that, about how do we navigate, um, doing what we need to for our clients, but also making sure that we are practicing ethically and legally within the realms of our license. And yeah, a lot of times comes up for students, especially in their day-to-day lives, is like being overloaded by everything happening. So there's been a lot of stuff in the news in regards to um, executive orders and stuff like that that could impact not only our clients but loved ones as well, and just figuring out like, okay, yes, these are things that we need to be aware of and things that aren't just going to magically go away, but also we weren't created as humans, or I like to think we weren't created as humans to like deal with all of this stuff. This is essentially trauma that we're all kind of
Mm-hmm.
going through, or many of us are going through, I would say.
Right. And I think something to note too is like when you think about how we've advanced as a civilization, we are so much more informed about the things of the world than what our ancestors were informed of. Because
Mm-hmm.
before, the only thing that mattered was what was happening in your immediate communities, because that's what
Mm-hmm.
directly impacted you. But it was also a simpler time in life where different communities were very separated from each other, where things that were happening within different communities was not directly affecting other communities. But now, because we live in the age of technology, not only do we have to be aware of what's happening in our immediate area, I like to call them like in our microsystem, but we're
Mm-hmm.
also informed about what's happening in the macro system as well. So that's within like the country that you live in and even within like the world that you live in. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's where it can feel like it's a lot because, you know, I don't want to think about what's happening over in like Europe is affecting what's happening here and vice versa. Like what we're
Mm-hmm.
doing here in the US is affecting what's happening in like Europe or Asia or whatever.
Yeah. And it can be a lot because, again, we're getting a lot of information all at once and sometimes from sources that are not agreeing about the same topic. But I also think it has, or at least in the past, been really helpful, especially for marginalized communities. I know I'm thinking about the Black community, especially with things like Black Lives Matter and stuff, especially in 2020 with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Just thinking about like if we didn't have access to technology that was able to share all that information, we wouldn't have known about some of these injustices that were happening. We wouldn't know about some of this like police violence that was happening as well. And I think it is helpful because, there are many people who especially weren't part of the Black community who didn't even know some of this was happening. But members of the Black community was like, yes, we've known that this has been happening. This has been happening not just for a couple of years or even a decade, but for generations. And though definitely unfortunate, it did help a lot of people realize that there's a lot of not so great things
Mm-hmm.
about our systems, or especially around our system of justice. But it helped people come together, and I'm also thinking about like the Me Too movement as well and how that started to like bring conversations around stuff like sexual harassment and sexual assault in both day-to-day and professional organizations. So I think media and having access to both the micro and macro, as you were saying, Natalie, is super helpful. But yeah, you are right. There is like, there's, everything in moderation. There's a certain level where it just feels like too much.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I am looking into as like a researcher that I'm really interested in is like called critical digital literacy. And critical digital literacy is basically the idea that every media has a purpose. Every media has something that they're trying to convey, and that piece of media is unbiased. All piece of media is biased because it's made by humans, and humans are biased creatures, no matter, even when we're trying not to be. And the idea of critical media literacy is that you need to critically evaluate, inform, and analyze media and be aware of like who is the audience, what is the purpose of this media, what is this media trying to convey, and also how does power and oppression play in terms of these media? Who is being invited into conversation, I guess you could say, with whatever piece of media this
Right, like
is,
who's sitting
and
at
who
the
is being
table.
excluded. Yeah. And yeah, and who's being excluded. And sometimes that exclusion is like on purpose. And that could be good or bad. And we can talk a little bit about like, examples of that being good versus that being bad. But it basically, again, has this idea that no piece of media is just like there. There's always a reason. Even if, you're just making up like a weird little meme, even that meme has a purpose. Even, ideally at best it has a purpose to make people laugh. It has a purpose of
Mm-hmm.
like having an inside joke. Even something like a meme has a purpose. It has an audience. It has people who will understand it, and has people like my mom, when I show her a meme, who don't understand it. And I think when we're talking about media overload, we also kind of had to have that conversation about critical digital literacy. Like, who is the audience for this piece of media?
Right. And I think something also to maybe point out too is that media literacy is not a new concept. I think because we live in the digital age, we need to look at it from a different angle. But when we talk about media literacy, like they teach you that in school when we talk about like critical thinking or critical reading skills. Because I remember in my reading class, whenever we did like our research projects, we would always have to like cross reference and verify facts, make sure that there are other sources that inform the same
Mm-hmm.
thing, right? But then those pieces of media usually came from like books or articles or
Mm-hmm.
journals and things like that. And so there's a different level of almost credibility because it's published in such an official way. But then when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about digital literacy, media literacy as well, anyone could publish anything on the internet, which I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a double-edged sword when we talk about media, because I think it's great that we're able to inform people. There's less censorship, there's less gatekeeping through just being able to share things online, share information. But on the other hand, there's a whole lot of rampant misinformation at the same time, just because
Mm-hmm.
there isn't a sort of like checks and balance to it all, opposed to like if we were looking at certain sources, like, when we talk about primary sources versus secondary sources, and
Mm-hmm.
then which one's more reliable and things like that. Very rarely do we have a lot of primary sources when we are talking about media and where their information comes from. A lot of it is anecdotal, or it's opinion pieces that sound like facts. And I think we
Mm-hmm.
need to learn how to be able to like critically look at those pieces of media and be able to decide like what is factual, what is opinion, what matches up with other things. And I think that's hard in this day and age for people.
Yeah, and especially, thinking about some of the recent media in regards to current events that's going on, a lot of it also has like this impact of, oh my gosh, something needs to be done now, or like, oh my gosh, we panic, And that's also a part of like media literacy. Like, why is it being done this way? And I think one thing that I've been learning a lot from other people who are much more knowledgeable in regards to the systems of this country and how the government works is that there are some things that happen and that occur that make it look like, for some, that the world is ending, for example. And not to say that those things should be taken seriously, not to say that those things aren't important, but because people are expecting a certain level of, how should I say this, a certain level of knowledge around certain topics, they use that to their advantage. And then with their version of media literacy, um, create media that invokes a certain reaction. And sometimes that reaction is not the best reaction, even though it's coming from a great place, even though it's coming from an authentic place for the viewer or the audience. I want to say not to get too political, but also, it's hard, especially as therapists, to talk about these things, to talk about social justice things and not get political. But I will try my best. Uh, but with the executive orders, for example, I was reading this piece in the New York Times that was basically talking about um, how some of the things that are happening in terms of the executive orders. It was by Ezra Klein, sorry. So the article is called "Don't Believe Him" by Ezra Klein. It's basically talking about how some of the things that are coming out in terms of the executive orders. Yes, we need to be aware of them. Yes, we need to be concerned about it. Yes, we need to reach out to our representatives and let them know that we do not want those things, but also to think about, like, why are they coming out as executive orders. And again, it's been a while since we had to take those government classes. I think, what was it, high school, Natalie, or
I want
maybe
to
middle
say,
school?
yeah, I want to
But
say high school.
yeah,
I don't think I recall ever doing a refresher in college about like how our government works.
yeah, and I think that's what a lot of people who are doing these type of medias, these decisions, are kind of banking on, that we haven't thought about this or don't really think about this in a while. But essentially, what Klein was saying is that um, the reason the reason why there's so many executive orders is, one, to distract, to kind of overwhelm us, to make us feel like, oh my gosh, the world is ending. And yes, we do need to be aware of, like, what's happening, because things, the lack of inaction could cause greater changes that we may not want. But also that the executive orders are happening because if things went about in the way that they were supposed to in this still imperfect system, but still system, then they would be caught. They would be stopped much quicker. And the only reason why executive orders are happening is because the likelihood of them actually passing, or passing as quickly in things like Congress and the Senate, um, is much slower. So there are some things like the birthright citizenship executive order that we know it was put out, and a judge has stopped it, has paused it, at least for right now. And that is good. That is good. That gives us a lot more time to advocate, to talk to our representatives and stuff like that. And again, it just shows that these executive orders, it, again, not to get too political, but like, yes, they do want them to pass and to actually be a thing, but they're more so for distraction. Yeah, yeah. I'll just leave it at that. It's more so for distraction.
And I think that's such a good point to bring up about like how our government works and all this and helping people stay informed as counselors, because I think that's what helps reduce the panic. And you're talking about like each piece of media, there's a purpose, there's an intended audience. And when we're talking about like news outlets, they're trying to sell newspapers or subscriptions, whatever you want to call it now. Social media, that's to get like clicks and likes and things like that. And so, of course, everything is going to be sensationalized and cause you to feel a certain way, because that's how you get people to keep reading, right? When you feel a certain way about it. But also, like, the reality of it is that our government system doesn't work so quickly that we have a complete overturn in the government in the way that we do things overnight. But that's what a lot of media is trying to make us believe, that, in the first like week or two of a new administration, our government's going to be turned upside down. And the reality is that it just doesn't work like that. And I think that's being able to know that fact about how our government actually works, I think helps to reduce like the anxiety that we have around it. Because like you said, that buys us time so that we have an opportunity to do something that helps our elected officials, other people, know that this is not something that we want as a body and as our government system. It's built in so that our voices are supposed to be heard. And so I think it's good that we are trying to find the real facts and use those as a way to inform the way that we respond to the situation, because we don't want to overreact. A lot of people, so in that first week of a new administration, I had lots of clients. Some people were joking, but a lot of them were just like, should I start doing this? Should I start preparing to like flee the country? All these things. And I'm just like, it's 1 week into this. There's lots of things happening, and maybe the best thing that we could do for ourselves right now is to disconnect just slightly, because we don't need to keep hearing all these things, and you certainly do not need to, I guess, check it every hour, which I think is what a lot of people were doing in that first week. Like, what's a new executive order that came out? What's a new crazy thing that I have to be worried about? And because the reality is that, it's good to be informed, but we don't need to respond to those right now in the way that we're, I guess, catastrophizing. One of the things that I read is, I guess, more kind of like an anecdotal, but a first-person perspective of somebody who lives in a country where it is more of a dictator type of government. And it was an open letter to Americans. And I thought it was really helpful. I can't remember what it was called or who it was from, but the point that it brought up was that it was reassuring Americans that, like, your government is not going to turn upside down overnight. Because in these dictator governments that this person was living in, it still took years for them to be able to consolidate power, to be able to overthrow the current government system so that it became more of a dictatorship. And so I think that was something that was very reassuring, because, it's firsthand source and piece of media to help us gain a little bit of perspective about, like, how does this actually all work? And also in that time when they had turned into a dictatorship government, it helped the public think about, like, how do they want to change their government. And so even then there's still changes that were happening regardless of the fact that they were under a more like dictator governmentship.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is the same thing. So I was, while you're talking, I was trying to find one actually that some, or at least something similar to what you're talking about. There was a reel that I saw, and it's like the 3 lessons from Russian descendants.
Yeah, that was the one.
Yeah, so maybe I'll make sure to put that in our bio, or in the episode log about that for anyone who's interested. Where, yeah, it did talk about, like, yeah, these are some things that you need to be aware of that has happened in the past. It's not like an immediate thing. It's something that takes time. And again, I also recognize, and I do want to acknowledge, that there are some things that are currently happening that were part of the executive orders that are really impacting people now, like with ICE and people being detained by ICE. So I do want to acknowledge that when we're talking about these things, we're not saying, like, yeah, nothing's happening. Like, so don't worry. Like, there are things happening. There are people being impacted. What we're saying is there's still time to make changes. Like, we have not hit the threshold yet. There's still potential, but we have not hit the threshold yet where where it's not completely unturnaroundable. But yeah, when you were talking, Natalie, I was trying to find something that I saw on Instagram. And, it's funny because, we're talking about media and talking about not being overloaded. And this is conversations that other people have had before. And again, probably have talked about it in a much more eloquent way than we're even talking about. But yeah, how we balance being aware of what's going on, not being ignorant of what's going on, but also balancing like our self care and stuff like that. And one of the things that I've seen a lot in trusted media from other advocates and people who want to see positive change happen in our government and in our society is to be in community. And, yeah, maybe for a variety of reasons, because of mental health, because of other things, always constantly scrolling on Instagram or TikTok or whatever social media platform probably is not the best. But at least stay in community with people who do have that like emotional capacity, that mental capacity to be checking in on things. And, maybe you're not the person who checks in on all of the new stuff, but you're the person who is doing care packages for people in the community who need it, who is teaching about things to be aware of with ICE and stuff like that. Because, you do have rights with that. And again, I'll put some more stuff in. Again, there's no way to not be political about this stuff, but I always fall back on the ACA Code of Ethics when it comes to these things and when it comes to talk about those things. And the ACA Code of Ethics said, like, these are things that we should talk about. Like inform our clients about things, make sure they know about all types of potential avenues. So I don't think this is getting too political, or I hope not.
I do want to throw in really quick that, it's hard to be non political as a therapist sometimes. I think opinions are different, but I don't think we always need to throw our opinions out there because that may not be helpful for people. But something in our code of ethics actually is that the ethics are actually higher than the governing laws. And so, as healthcare providers in general, our obligation is to our code of ethics, regardless of what the law is. And I think this is why it's also a scary time for counselors as well, is that we are providing the best inclusive care as we can, even if it runs contrary to what some of the government things are right now. Right. And I think that's why it's a little scary that we're towing a line, because we want to be able to do no harm to our clients. But there are laws right now, well, maybe not laws that are in place, but like proposed things in law that do actually threaten whether or not our clients are getting the best care that we can provide them.
I feel the need to say this because I feel like there are some counselors in training listening to this, and just other counselors in general. We're not saying like do crime, break the law. As therapists, we still need to follow the law, especially if we want to keep our license. But what Natalie is saying is that sometimes the laws aren't moral. Sometimes the laws aren't just. And it's our job as therapists to, one, be aware of the laws, but also to advocate for moral and just laws as well. And sometimes the code of ethics, though not perfect, and, still waiting for that update ACA, they are a little bit better in terms of being aware of the moral and justice part than sometimes the law, which is need to think about. But again, not going to go into that because that's my opinion. But so Natalie's not saying go do crime.
Definitely not just out there do crimes.
Yeah, but just be aware that sometimes the code of ethics, which is what we as professionals are being upheld to, don't always align with the law. And then that's our job and responsibilities as therapists to make sure that we're advocating for our clients, to advocate for the communities that they're from, and also to advocate for the communities that we're from, to make sure that we have laws that do ideally align with our code of ethics. So I just wanted to say that before.
Good clarification. Yeah, very good clarification. It's hard to articulate that sometimes, but I think you articulate that well for us.
Ethics is my favorite class to teach, and I'm teaching it this semester, so my brain is very ethics minded right now. But yeah, so community advocacy, realizing that advocacy looks different. It's not just about protesting in the streets, though that is important. Sometimes it's about teaching, sometimes it's about providing care, sometimes it's about, a whole bunch of different things. So if you're not sure how you can advocate and make change. One, there's a lot of different things out there. There's a lot of different services and apps that one, you just have to input your information and it'll send out emails and stuff, or it'll provide you with call scripts that you can call your representatives. Sometimes that's one of the easiest things that people do. If you're financially in a place where you can provide money to organizations and community bonds as well, that's something you can do as well. I think it's also for people who are just starting out, who are very new to some of this, who are realizing that there's a lot about the US and the world in general that needs to be changed. Sometimes it's best to go to organizations, look for organizations that have already been doing this work for a long time. In that way, you're also making sure that you're not burning out because you're not trying to start from new. So instead of, trying to create your own new thing, really ask yourself, hey, are other people doing this? Are other people who are experts, and not just in terms of academia, but just experts in terms of just doing this, advocating this for longer? Have they been doing this for a long time? Let me find them. Let me learn from them. Let me hear from them what needs to be done. And let me see if there's any way that I can give my skills, or again, financial money too, as well. There's a whole bunch of people out there. Instead of having many multi different groups doing their own thing and directed towards the same way, if we can come together as larger groups and work together as a larger group, that has more impact, positive impact in terms of change. So actually what comes to mind is this quote from Audre Lorde that says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare, which is, really intense. Why I like that quote, but basically what it's saying is part of advocacy, part of social justice is being able to not only take care of other people, but take care of yourself, whatever that looks like. Again, it's not always taking bubble baths or getting your nails done, though sometimes for some people that is actually something that can drastically improve their mood. But again, making sure that you're drinking water, making sure you're taking your medication, make sure you're going to therapy if therapy is helping you and stuff like that. Whatever is self-care, making sure that you're being filled so that you can fill in others who need your help. And that's something that I think you and I, Natalie, have to constantly remind ourselves as therapists who are mental health professionals, who are helping professionals, that in order to do our best work, especially ethically, because it's also in our code of ethics, we need to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves so that we can ideally be the best selves for our clients as well.
Yeah, and I think this is such a big thing that a lot of people don't recognize, because I hear that a lot from people, that self-care feels selfish. And I think that it's part of what we're taught as a society, that we should be thinking about other people. We shouldn't, be so focused on ourselves and things like that. But the reality is that, like, self-care is about you being able to refresh yourself so that you could continue to pour into others. Like, you can't help anyone if you can't help yourself first. It's that idea when you're on the plane and they do like that safety demo, and they're like, make sure you put the life jacket over you first and the oxygen mask over you first before you help somebody else, because if you're not breathing, you're definitely not going to help the person next to you breathe, right? And so that is what self-care is. It's not selfish, because you are doing that so that you are able to help somebody else. I think it's different if you put on the mask and then you just watch everybody else suffocate, right? That's when we could say, like, okay, maybe that's a little selfish, right? But if what you're doing is to be able to, like, take care of yourself so that you can help take care of others, like, that is what self-care is. It is not selfish. It is actually very selfless, because if we're not giving the best of ourselves to people, then how are we going to be able to help them, right? And so we have to be our best selves to be able to help somebody else. And I think you bring up a lot of really good points just about what do we do with all this media that we are consuming, because I think it's easy for us to get emotional and overwhelmed and feeling anxious about everything. And then we don't know what to do with that, because a lot of these things, it's out of our hands. There's things that we as individuals can't really do to affect the macro system. And so I think what I've been helping clients think about is like, how do you come back down to your microsystem then, which looks like what you're talking about, being able to participate in community things, being able to talk to your representatives of your states or be able to like protest and things like that. Because, we need to focus on tangible things that we have control over right now. And it's not helpful for us to just dwell on the things that we can't do anything about. I think this makes us do a lot of like doom and gloom, but that's not helpful for you. It's not helpful for other people. And so you do need to focus a little bit on like, what can I do to help affect this? And in a way, it's like we have to refocus our minds to the present moment, because we can't directly, change the future right now, and we can't change the past. So we do need to think about like, what tangible task could I do right now, if there is a tangible task? Because also there's lots of things where there isn't a tangible task. And so those are the moments where we do just need to sit with the discomfort and let it pass, or until we get more information. So I think it's good for people to be thinking about like, what can you do if there is actually something to do?
Yes, because again, I think a lot of people are coming from this from a very well-meaning place, but sometimes people's first reaction when they hear about these injustices or hear about these things that are putting a lot of other people at great risk is to react. And though that again is coming from a great place, with the amount of stuff that's coming out, especially in the last few weeks, if you're reacting to all of that, that's exhausting. So again, being aware of, what's already out there, what's important. I think also we need to realize that we're all in this together, as cliche as it sounds. High School Musical reference, but like, there are so many people who are angry and frustrated at other people who are marginalized, at other people who are dealing with just as much like social injustice as they are. And, again, that's like another tactic that I believe this administration is trying to do, trying to have us turn on each other. And, a lot of times we talk about MLK and, his I Have a Dream speech on MLK Day was just like a few weeks ago. But we forget to talk about that MLK was like he wasn't just like all love and rainbows and stuff like that. He also was like very like, no, we need to do this. Like, we can't just talk the talk. We need to actually walk the walk. And then also thinking about like Malcolm X, who was another one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s like contemporaries. Again, a lot of people tend to talk about them in opposition of each other, but they actually overlapped in a lot of ways. And one thing that I always think about with Malcolm X is how, yes, he was focused on the liberation of Black folks and Black folks in this country and Black Americans, but he also did partner up with other racial ethnic groups. Like, like one of his like BFFs during that time was this Asian woman who was focused on not only making sure that Asian American rights, but also Asian American rights with Black American rights as well. And I think, again, thinking about media, thinking about how some of these legislations that are happening on the state level and even on the government level are trying to like erase history. Because again, this is facts, not opinions. Government organizations like the CDC and NIH are telling researchers that there are certain terms that you can't use. And certain terms, again, this is not a exhaustive list, but one of the terms is you can't use Black women, you can't use Black men, you can't even use Black in research. So I'm like, how are you going to describe these people? you know and like, I think I also said like you can't say Hispanic or Latino or Latina or stuff like that. And again, part of that is to take away history. I know a lot of people will say like, no, it's just to show that we're all the same, equal rights, whatever. But we have to be aware of where our country came from. We have to be aware of the history of things. Otherwise, we will, just like the reel that Natalie and I were talking about, where other folks from other countries, we're just repeating that history again.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I especially right now, I've just been thinking a lot about like, I guess you could call them our ancestors and how they worked not only for the freedom and liberation of the people within their communities, but also for other communities as well, other marginalized communities. And I think we need to really refocus on that as well,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it kind of turned, as unfortunate to say, I feel like I see so many things online where it turns into like this oppression Olympics, where it's just like, no, give us this rights, blah blah blah, at the risk of other rights, and not just in terms of racial ethnic identities, but also in terms of LGBTQ plus identities. There was this amazing speech that I almost teared up by. I think it was at the NAACP Awards, where Gabrielle Union and her husband, who Dwayne Wade, they gave a speech about in the Black community. We not only need to yes, we need to take care of the Black community, but we also need to realize that when we say Black community, we're talking about all the Black community. We're talking about the LGBTQ plus part of the Black community too. We're talking about trans Black people as well, especially as parents of a trans child. And that speech like just really made me tear up, because I feel like oftentimes when we're talking about like the liberation of Black people or the liberation of like Asian people or like Latino Hispanic people, whatever, it's very broad. And then when we ask to be a little bit more specific, or at least a little bit more inclusive, it gets a little bit murky. And it's just like, oh no, not those people. And I feel like I'm going on a rant, so I apologize, Natalie and listeners. But I guess I just really wanted to emphasize that we need to all come together as a community. We need to, stop trying to nitpick things and be like, what about this? And realize that if we focus on the liberation of those who are most at risk, then that leads to the liberation of everyone. And I think, again, just another history part, because again, I like history, but also I've been talking a lot about this and with my students. If we think back to like disability rights, for example, it was advocates who had physical disabilities that created and that advocated for these disability rights. And because of that, we have things that benefit a lot of different people. There's this documentary on Netflix called, I think, Crip Camp. I don't know if it's the most extensive or exhaustive like piece of documentary in terms of everything that goes, but one thing that really stood out to me with that documentary is that things like elevators, things that we typically take for granted in terms of just like, even with people like ourselves who are not physically disabled, like that came from those disability rights, and that benefits the larger population. Like it benefits people who may have like child carriages or child strollers, and like before there weren't elevators at all places, and imagine you have like a stroller and you're trying to get down the steps or up the steps. But because of what people who had the most to lose, who were most at risk, because they were advocated for that, because they had allies who helped advocate for that, we have these rights, these accessibility stuff that also positively impacts other people who aren't necessarily the initial people who were part of that. So long rant short is, we're all in this together, folks.
Yeah, and you bring up some really good concepts for people to think about, because, I think something that I think we heard a lot over the past years of people trying to navigate how do we talk about diversity, ethnic groups, racism, things like that. There are people who will bring up this idea like of being colorblind, like, oh, I don't see color, I don't see these things. And I think while well intentioned for some people, I think they really miss the point that it dismisses the differences in different ethnic groups and what they've gone through, what their oppression has been. You know, like, I would love for people to treat me as an equal person as somebody else, regardless of like what my identifiers are. But also, I don't want to erase those identifiers because those are important to me. So there's this difference between like treating everyone as humans, you know, just being somebody who is, you know, I want to say, I want to say humanitarian. That's like the best way that I could describe it.
Equitable.
Yeah, equitable. That's a term we can't necessarily use anymore. But anyway, sorry. But you know, we want to be able to treat everybody with the same human dignity. I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Right? Everybody is entitled to human dignity because they exist as humans, but we also need to acknowledge that, you know, they have a unique history depending on what their identifiers are. And so, you know, colorblindness is not a helpful concept because it erases that history. And I think that ends up being a lot more harmful for people as well, because then we end up forgetting, like what you were talking about, like the history of what a lot of different people had to go through, and different movements in order for people to gain rights. And I think that's where it becomes dangerous, because the less that we know about the past, the more likely we are to repeat that in the future. And it's unfortunate because we continue to see that happening. One of the things that is always on my mind is the Japanese internment camps. I'm not Japanese, but you know, that's one of the, as an Asian person, that was one of the things that I learned about in history, that during the war, the Japanese American people who were citizens, not even Japanese, you know, immigrants or people who were here like on green cards and stuff like that, but they were Japanese Americans. They were all taken into this concentration camp because people were not able to differentiate like who was friend, who was foe, and just because they looked Japanese, they were forced to uproot their lives, and they had to live in, I guess, like this camp, and their families had to be there, and you know, it was a huge mess. But then we're seeing that happen now in with different ethnic groups too, and I think that's what's scary to watch that happen. And so one of my favorite songs is Kenji by Fort Minor. So if people get a chance to listen to it, it's such a great song. But that was the first time in media where I heard somebody actually talk about the Japanese internment camps. You know, the artist is Japanese American, and some of it's personal to him because that is his family history, Mike Shinoda. But that was the first time in like media that wasn't like a newspaper article where somebody acknowledged that, and it was mainstream. People were learning about the Japanese internment camps for the first time through a song. And now, because of what's happening in current news, that's coming up again, and people are starting to be informed of like, hey, this parallels with something that's happened in history. And we know how all that turned out too. You know, it ended up with like restitution, and families of Japanese Americans who were in the internment camps, they were, there was like a formal apology and things like that, to acknowledge what's actually happened. But that's,
Was there?
I think there was a formal apology.
Oh, okay.
I don't think there were.
I'm surprised there's a. Okay.
I don't think there were many other restitution things happening. Like, I don't think there's financial compensation or anything like that.
Oh, yeah. Still waiting on my 40 acres.
Right? All the ethnic groups that need financial compensation for what they've gone through in history. But I think like that acknowledgement is important, though. It acknowledges a wrong, and it puts it on our radar that we don't want to be like that again because of the injustice that happened. And so this is why it's so important for us to be aware of media and history, because that's what helps us just understand like what are the results of things that are happening now. And so I think that's a really helpful piece of like social media these days, where like it is a way for people to talk about history and bring up the parallels of it.
Yeah. And when you were talking, I was thinking about like, when did I first learn about the Japanese camps? And honestly, I don't think it was even from like school. It was from the American Girls Molly. I think it was the Molly book where they talked about it. And shout out to American Girls because they were talking about like some like very touchy topics, and but making it like accessible for like young girls, young children, because you don't have to be a girl just to read American Girls. And yeah, so shout out to American Girls. I hope they're still, not holding back. But yeah, it's so weird, and it's again, we're like you said, we're seeing it right now. We're seeing those things, but again, you know, a lot of states legislation are trying to get rid of those things, and again, realizing that history is, or at least history as we know it, history that is proposed to us is very constructed by those in power. And those in power kind of, don't like to always admit that they were wrong. So, yeah. And I mean, honestly, we're seeing kind of some of that as well with social media as well. So, social media, as we said before, has its ups and downs. It has historically, in terms of advocacy, been really helpful in terms of getting things out that traditional news sources either couldn't get out in a timely way or didn't want to get out in a timely way. However, with all of like the social media moguls, I guess you could call them, being part of this administration, we do need to be careful in regards to where certain content is coming from, how the algorithm is playing a role, what's being hidden, what's being shown, that type of thing. Again, going back to that critical digital literacy piece that we talked about before. But as of right now, there's still a lot of really amazing content creators who are advocates who have been studying these topics, who have been studying and trying to think about best practices in terms of making our world and our society and our country more socially just. So, it's just a matter of like, again, asking yourself, like, what is the purpose of this media?
Well, I do want to ask you, Zori, like, what do you think is that line between being informed and the media overload? Because, I think we've talked a lot about like the positives of media, but then I think there's also this line of like when it becomes detrimental. So, like, for you, what do you think that line is?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, I think that line is really dependent on each person. I do think you need to be aware of your own boundaries, and it takes time for that to happen. So, like for myself, I know I can, for the most part, scroll on Instagram and sure be justified, like, understandably annoyed or frustrated by things I'm seeing. But Instagram, I think maybe just because I grew up with that, that's a platform that I grew up with. I feel like I can handle it better than something like TikTok. Like TikTok, I realized after a while that TikTok was where I really doom scrolled, or at least doom scrolled in a way that I saw was impacting my mental health. So I've kind of, even though I still have the TikTok app, I still, and I'm wondering if I want to even continue to still have it, especially after everything that happened with the great TikTok death, but then revival. But I realized with TikTok that was where I was doing a lot of doom scrolling. And so I think part of it is like realizing your boundaries. Part of it is realizing that sometimes different platforms kind of invoke different things just based off of the nature of the content that's found there. I also find myself kind of straying away from X for a variety of reasons. One, because of who's currently owning it, but also because a lot of academics have made the great migration to Blue Sky or to Threads. So I feel like right now I'm usually just using Instagram. I have an idea of the sources that are typically good sources. I think also what's helpful, and this is something that could be helpful for anyone, is find sources that you that are legit, that you feel align with your morals around social justice and stuff like that. And some of them have like these brief like news that you may have missed or important news that you should know. So one that's coming to mind is So Informed. I don't know this person. I don't know the person who behind it, but I will admit that sometimes even when Instagram is kind of like making me like really low, I do check So Informed, and there's probably other ones, but So Informed is just coming to my mind. And they typically have some sort of like weekly like description of like news that they think you should know. And I think sometimes having that is a little bit helpful in terms of like me still wanting to be engaged and wanting to be aware of what's going on in the world, but also not feeling so overwhelmed. So I guess I would say that like find newsletters by like sources that you feel like you can trust, and see and get some of your news, especially when you're feeling overwhelmed that way, if that's helpful, to still stay connected. But yeah, what about you, Natalie?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. And, I do also want to add on that you don't want to create an echo chamber for yourself, though.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's really helpful to find like news sources that you trust and that you align with, but I think it's also important to be able to hear what other people are saying as well, just so that you have a moment to, I guess this goes back to like the critical digital media literacy, like
Mm-hmm.
cross check your references, right? Hear
Mm-hmm.
about what other sources are talking about, just so that you can, again, like be more informed and be able to have more information to gauge how you feel or make decisions based off of. But, I think also it's important for you to think about personally that line for you is like, when do you get overwhelmed or when do you get anxious? And I think one of the biggest indicator is when you start having like that overwhelming helpless feeling
Mm-hmm.
and that like doom and gloom kind of attitude, like, oh, there's nothing I could do to affect
Mm-hmm.
this, or the world's just going to end, so why bother? I don't think that's a helpful mindset to have, because the reality
Mm-hmm.
is like that's catastrophizing. World's not ending tomorrow. There are still things that you could do, right? But I think when you hit that feeling, that's when you might have to think about like what you were saying, like the boundaries. Like, are there certain media platforms that are better for you than others? Or even like, do I need to change the amount of time I spend on media? Right? Do I need
Mm-hmm.
to limit it to a certain time of the day where I feel like I can tolerate it better? Or is there a time limit because at some point it's just like doom scrolling? Right? And I think, again, that's very personal for people. I think people have the ability to tolerate some of the larger news things and the information things on different scales. And so I think that's something that people need to determine personally. But I think again, you have to be informed somehow. So, it's not quite like this black and white of like be in social media all the time or always be informed versus not being
Mm-hmm.
informed at all, because I don't think it's helpful to not be informed. So, yeah,
Ignorance is not bliss.
right. So you have to find that middle ground of like, okay, I know what's going on in the world, but it's not creating this overwhelming sense of like everything is hopeless and, the world's just going to burn anyways, so why bother? So I guess going back to like what is helpful for somebody and how do I reroute that to something more tangible? I think that's something that I've been thinking about for myself, but also for clients and friends and family to think about, is that like, if I can't do anything about this, then this is something that I can't put too much thought and energy into. So that becomes another
Mm-hmm.
mental boundary that I have, that like I just can't devote the energy into these like helpless and hopeless kind of thoughts, because there's no point in me, just like sitting in that feeling when there are other things I can be doing.
Mm-hmm. And again, realizing the importance of community, because there's some things that you can't do individually that you can do in community. And again, seeking out the people who've already been doing this work for a long time, because none of this is new, unfortunately. So, yeah. Okay. Oh, Natalie, I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us for another episode of Therapy on a Tangent. If you like what you listened to today, please remember on Spotify and or Apple Podcasts to give us a rating and review. And if you're listening to us on YouTube, to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, so you can be notified of our new videos. And if there's a topic that you would like to hear about in the future, either put it in the comments or email us at our email at therapyonatangentpod at gmail.com. Again, that's therapyonatangentpod at gmail.com. Well, I'm Zori.
I'm Natalie.
And stay on tangent, folks.